I'm a 22-year-old college senior about to graduate and start medical school in the fall. This happened when I was in elementary school, so about a decade ago. Over the summer way back then, my mom sent me to a YMCA summer camp. I enjoyed going in every day and hanging out with all my friends from school who also went to the camp. But I loved one of the counselors, Mike. Mike was always sitting in these same spots when I got dropped off in the morning, and he would see me walk in and put a huge smile on his face. We would always sit there and play cards or some other board game in the morning, while all the other kids were arriving. Once the day's scheduled activities started, Mike would always be the counselor in charge of my group. He would always be just close to me. As a kid, I didn't know that was weird. I really liked him, as I said, and I thought he was a really cool guy as an 8-year-old. Fast forward a couple of years. I don't remember the exact time frame or timeline, I'm sorry. My mom, my younger sister, and I were out at a state park in the area, about a half hour from where we lived. We had just gone down there to hang out for the day. We were having a great time on the playground, walking around the trails, etc. And then we headed back to the car. When we arrived back at the car, my mom was getting my sister all strapped in and ready for the ride home, and I was getting situated in the back seat as well. Now, our car was in the parking lot, obviously, and there really weren't tons of people at the park that day. The lot was pretty much empty. So when I noticed that there was a car parked right next to our car, I was like, that's weird. But again, I was a kid and didn't really think anything of it. Why would this car park literally right next to us when I can see 50 empty spots from right here? Anyways, my mom was getting my sister and I all ready for the trip back home, as I said. Suddenly, the driver door of the other car opens and out pops Mike. My mom recognized him, so she just said, "Hi," and continued back to what she was doing. Mike says, "Do you mind if I take a couple of pictures with your son? He's gotten so grown and I want to remember this." My mom obviously goes, "No, you're not going to do that," and shuts the driver's door and unlocks the car and we leave. As we're leaving, I can see Mike trying to take a photo through the windows of the car. A couple of years later, when I was a bit older, my mom told me more details about Mike. My mom at the time was a pretty high up in a company that pairs kids with adult mentors. Adults would apply to be paired with a kid. So my mom starts telling me about how one day they were going through the applications to be a mentor, and Mike's name popped up. Apparently, somebody else had interviewed Mike and recommended him for approval into the system. My mom, on the other hand, essentially vetoed it because she obviously had known Mike from these other experiences and she got a weird vibe from him that something was off with him. So finally, we're watching the news at dinner one day a bit later. They start sharing a story about a man who was arrested, and they show the mugshot of said man. Mike. The charge: thousands of images and videos of inappropriate things that he was in possession of. He was actually caught by the Border Patrol, as he was acting weird when he was trying to cross into Canada, and they decided to search his car and they found a bunch of it on his computer. They alerted US authorities who then searched his house and they found a ton more of it. I am 100% confident that he wanted to add me to the collection. If not for my mom having a great mother's instinct and the Canada-US border, it might have happened. So, this happened many years ago when I was about 9 or 10. I scared my kid self crazy at that point. Our family was invited to a summer beginning barbecue party for some of my parents' close friends. Everybody was having a great time. There were many other families and kids there, about 60 people I would say. The family's backyard was pretty widespread and directly attached to a forest-like bush part, which you could enter through their yard. It's right next to their yard, so you could still see all the people and hear chatter and music through the leaves and branches. I linked up with some of the other kids there and we went on playing in the wood part. Hide and seek, I guess. With us was this annoying and whining girl that started acting up continuously due to her getting found all the time, to the point where everybody was fed up with her. She lost her shoe later on after tripping over a branch. I grabbed it and yeeted it into some bush and all the kids started laughing. It's pretty mean, I know, but we were all some sassy little kids at one point. She left the brush, crying and screaming without her shoe. Oh boy, I knew stuff was going down because literally the whole neighborhood could hear her going absolutely mental. We went on playing until her dad entered the brush with a really serious and angry face. I didn't notice at first, but I saw all the other kids looking behind me, making me turn around and meeting his face right in front of mine. "Everybody leave," he said in a monotone voice, his eyes fixed on me. I knew he was not referring to me, so I stood my sassy 9-year-old ground, trying not to look bothered at all. "So, you're the one who threw, I don't remember her name's, shoe into the woods, huh?" I went, "Nope, I don't know what you're talking about, sir," not believing a single word that he answered. "You go and search for it, I'll be right behind you." I resigned and went to look for it. It was like 30 feet away in some muddy brush. I picked it up and was about to turn around when this guy grabbed my hair, pulled it until I was in visible pain, and started squeaking and went right up to my face and said, "Do you know what happens to little kids that lie?" I was completely frozen in anxiety and just stuttered, Yeah, I do," in the hope that he would let go because I knew. Me not knowing what rhetorical questions were to that time didn't help the situation. He continued to stare at me for about 5 or 10 seconds, let go, and left without another word. I ran out of the bush, tears on my face, not really crying, looking more angry than scared because of the helplessness that I felt. My parents looked at me and asked what was going on. I ran past them through the house, out of the road, and stood right next to our car with my arms crossed, indirectly demanding for us to leave. My parents and some of the other people caught up to me and asked what in the world was going on. I burst out and told them what had happened. If I had to describe how pure hatred and anger looked on a parent's face, it was the look in my dad's face in that moment. Without a word, he rushed back and my mom and the other 2 parents stayed with me, comforting and calming me down. My dad came back, still with the furious look in his face, and he started hugging me. My mom went back in, said goodbye to everyone, and we laughed. I didn't describe what the guy looked like, so I guess my dad just told the party host and asked around if anybody had witnessed it. Thinking about it now, if I would have told them what he looked like, and knowing my dad, may God have had mercy on his soul. The guy was definitely a sociopath, doing that stuff to a kid with many people around potentially witnessing it. So, you psycho, let's never meet again. Back in my high school years, I would often meet with a few friends at a local Dunkin' Donuts, which was conveniently near a railway that we had all take to our weed guy's house. My closest friend at the time, Katie, and I usually met up earlier than everyone else just to hang out. We would order our extra large drinks and hash browns and attempted some, hey Mr. Shenanigans, to score some tall boys from anyone willing to buy us beer. I would consider us to be pretty naive and overly nice girls, which never proved to be an issue to either of us, until we were nice to the wrong person. Now, for a little background on my hometown, I grew up in the forgotten borough of NYC, Staten Island. For those who are unaware, there was, and kind of still is, a pretty horrendous opioid epidemic. So, seeing zombie-like civilians join the streets is fairly common. And because of this, I became pretty good at spotting out someone struggling with heroin and things of the sort. Anyways, on this one day, Katie and I met up at Dunkin' and sat at our usual booth. We were in the midst of messing around with our phones and being our overly giggly selves when I noticed out of the corner of my eye, someone suddenly stop outside of the glass door. Still smiling, I glanced over to see if it was maybe one of our friends, and I ended up making direct eye contact with a basic Staten Island looking dude. I looked away, unbothered, and carried on. Just another customer anyways. After the guy got his coffee, he sat directly at the table across from our booth. I chose to ignore the fact he sat weirdly close and resisted eye contact, since that already awkwardly happened. But I guess the motion caught Katie's attention, as she looked over her shoulder at the man settling in. She looked back at me, made a face that said, okay, and we just giggled and tried to move on. Every now and then, I glanced in his direction, mainly just because I like to be observant of my surroundings, but also because I kept seeing him scratch at his nose, his neck and face in my peripheral vision, and noticed that he was bleeding from various little cuts on his body. This was a dead giveaway he was doing some form of opioid, as they tend to get very itchy and scratch until they break skin. A few minutes later, the man asked if one of us had a charger that he could borrow. I kindly denied, and Katie only had an iPhone charger while the man clearly had an Android phone. This slight exchange was enough for the man to feel invited, and he would continue to make comments for quite some time. Being that this was about 4 years ago, I don't remember the entire conversation, but I do remember him often asking general questions like if we live around here, what we do on our free time, and creepy things of the sort. I was pretty vague yet polite in my responses, but Katie was always a bit more enthusiastic in her words, making it pretty easy for this guy to reciprocate and basically join our conversation altogether. In Katie's innocent stupidity, the guy basically found out some of the main train stops that we would get off at to hang in those areas. He also found out that we would indulge in the devil's lettuce, which only made this guy feel even more inclined. At some point he mentioned how his ex-girlfriend got him into some trouble, got him into heroin which he used to sell, served jail time for, and pretty recently got out. He also mentioned how he's been an ice cream truck driver ever since his release, and told us that he's always driving around the train stops Katie had mentioned earlier. He also repeatedly offered to give us rides around in his truck someday, with free ice cream as a bribe. Again, we were pretty naive and overall nice girls, Katie more so than I. So one thing led to another, and eventually this guy was asking for Katie's social media, which she happily obliged to. She's always been really dedicated to expanding her follower count. Throughout this entire exchange, I was mostly just nodding, smiling, laughing here and there. So, my remaining silent during the social media exchange went unnoticed. However, once the guy started following Katie on Instagram, he quickly found mine through a tagged picture on her page. I was in private at the time, so he immediately started liking and commenting on nearly every one of my pictures. The comments were extremely cringy, consisting of hard eyes and water squirt emojis, and things like, "Damn, ma." Finally, after the longest half hour ever, I urged that we should really be catching our train. Fortunately, the man wasn't persistent after that, and we were on our way with no problem. After some verbal recap of what had just happened, I convinced Katie to block him, and I did the same, and we brushed it off with that. I honestly forgot about the strange interaction until about a week later, I was hanging out with some friends at a park near my high school when munchies made me crave Ralph's Ice, which was just up the block. I ventured off with one other friend, and I almost made it to the store before the sound of an ice cream truck approached from behind us. Completely lost in conversation, my attention was only caught by the high-pitched screeching of the truck's brakes and a somewhat familiar voice. Of course it was him. He shouted out to me, but with Ralph's only a couple feet in front of us, I ignored him and rushed in with my friend. The guy didn't stick around for that long because he was blocking the whole lane on a narrow two-way road, but we still called our friend at the park to pick us up in his car. For the next 2 weeks, there were about 4 times this man tried to pick me up in his truck, at this point making me pretty paranoid that I was potentially being stalked. The last time it happened, he was parked directly outside of one of the train stops, almost as if he was waiting for me. He again called out to me asking why I blocked him, and saying that he really just wanted to be friends. At this point, I'd had enough and told him to just leave me alone. My dad's the lieutenant, which was a lie but slipped out in my defense. I walked away before he could respond and into the diner I was meeting my friends at that night. I saw his truck drive away in the window and never had an interaction with the ice cream man again. The sound of an ice cream truck has haunted me ever since. When I was 6 years old, I loved the fire candles because it fascinated me, which it still does. Around the time of Halloween, where we carved pumpkins and made lanterns out of it, I got a little bit too excited and couldn't wait for my mom to help light the candle. I snuck around with one of the candles and dumb 6-year-old me thought, hey, I can show them how much I've grown up. I could light this candle myself. Or so I thought. For a reason I don't know anymore, I lit the candle up behind our couch and got a little bit too close. And then it happened. My shirt started to burn and I ran into the kitchen, where the rest of my family was. My brothers both started to scream. Meanwhile, my mother ripped the burning shirt off my body. All the while, my stepdad played WoW. A few hours after this, I still wasn't in the hospital because my stepdad thought it would be a great reason to start a fight over this. Fast forward about 2 weeks. I had been in the hospital for this entire time and had multiple operations behind me because apparently 3 plastic-like threads got burned into my skin and they needed to be removed. I also had 2 skin grafts, one time from my butt which didn't work, and one successful one for my thigh. After this operation, I got introduced to my new roommate, a kid who was there for a reason I didn't know. 3 weeks forward, I became friends pretty quickly with my new roommate. We played, watched TV, and did everything we could while being in a hospital. Our families tried to visit us as much as possible, if work would allow it. Because my mom usually works overtime, she asked her boss if she could get some days off, which he thankfully agreed to. So, in the 6th and last week of my hospital stay, my mom visited me every day, and on the last day, she also got to spend a night in the hospital with me and my new roommate. On this last night, I noticed a shadow on my bed. I got scared and screamed. My mom woke up immediately and turned the light on. And there he was. It was my roommate, and in his hand was a knife, which he had somehow managed to hide from the nurses. According to my mom, he whispered the whole time that he didn't want me to leave, that he could make me his best friend if he wanted to. It turned out that he was 14 and had some kind of mental illness, and he was there because he had tried to hurt himself. Luckily, we left soon after that, and I haven't heard anything from the kid again.